In today's video, we're going to talk very open and honestly about something that's been happening more recently with Dragon Ball over the last few storylines, and to also talk about the current state of the Dragon Ball Super manga. And starting off with the Dragon Ball Super manga, I'm going to be honest with you guys, it just feels very stale right now. And to be honest with you, I actually had a lot of fun reviewing the filler arcs with Goten and Trunks, because even though they were essentially filler, it was new content that I felt like we could make jokes and have fun seeing Goten and Trunks in more slice-of-life type stories. But when it comes to the Super Hero arc, it feels like we're going back in time to Dragon Ball Super, where we were watching episodes in the Battle of Gods and the Resurrection of F arc, and because these episodes were based off of a movie, as opposed to, in most anime and manga situations, you have the manga that comes out and then the anime adapts to what the manga originally was, and in Dragon Ball Super's case, because the anime technically came out first, the manga was always behind. But when it's based off of a movie, it feels even worse, because the thing about a movie is that it's supposed to be self-contained within less than 2 hours. So when you're reading manga chapters on it, or when you're watching weekly episodes on it, it just feels very slow in its pacing. And to be more specific with Battle of Gods and Resurrection F, I remember when I was reviewing episodes in the Battle of Gods and Resurrection of F arc, it was extremely challenging because I felt like I really couldn't give the greatest reviews I possibly could, because the episodes were simply just worse, stretched out versions of what all of us already saw in the Dragon Ball movies. And as a result of it, it felt like, hey guys, in today's episode, Goku fought against Frieza with worse animation, and there were more additional scenes that just stretched out the episode to 20 minutes. That's kind of what it felt like. And looking at these more recent Dragon Ball Super manga chapters, it feels very similar to this, where a lot of the times it just feels like, okay, there might be some new adaptations in the manga variant, but we know exactly what's gonna happen because we already saw the movie. And I feel like a lot of us are simply just waiting for what's gonna happen with Black Frieza and arcs that are gonna happen after this, where we don't know what's gonna happen and they're not basing it off of something that was originally a movie, so the pacing's gonna be extremely stretched out. And the thing about the manga, and the last point that I'll make on the subject before we move on, is that because the manga comes out once a month, as opposed to you getting 4 or 5 episodes a month based off of how many weekends they are, it feels even worse, because it's like you wait an entire month to get a manga chapter that's only slightly different from something that you're already aware of what's gonna happen anyways. But to get all of that stuff out of the way, guys, the bigger issue that we're going to talk about in today's video is something that's been floating around the Dragon Ball community ever since the Granola arc, really, and it's happened multiple times, and now it's happening in Dragon Ball Super Hero and now with the manga, where Dragon Ball is following this trend that I really hope gets broken, where characters are getting transformations in extremely cheap ways. Now, back in the day, let's be honest, Dragon Ball's economy completely works off of transformations, and I completely understand that, and from a business perspective, having transformations expands the series, so there's no qualms about that at all. But when you start giving characters transformations in ways that don't really feel justified, it just feels really cheap, right? And this is something that also happened with Gas and Granola, where they didn't necessarily get transformations in the way that I'm discussing, but going back to the Granola arc, and specifically with Granola and Gas, they basically used the Dragon Balls to wish for themselves to be the strongest mortals in the universe, essentially. And the thing about that is that it kind of feels like Dragon Ball lost a little bit of its luster in those arcs, because even though I liked a lot of moments from the Granola arc, it just kind of felt like if you're going to have a villain that's just weaker than our characters, but he's just going to essentially cheat to get as strong as us, it just feels cheap, and when you go back to a villain like Frieza, going all the way back to the Namek arc, Frieza was just extremely powerful. And ever since King Kai essentially mentioned Frieza for the first time, there was this aura about how powerful Frieza was. And then as you saw Frieza fight and how you saw how many transformations Frieza had, there was this level of intensity that Frieza brought to the scenes, especially when Goku was fighting him and Frieza could power up into his 100% form. So even as a Super Saiyan, we knew that Goku wasn't even fighting Frieza at his best. And then when you move on to a villain like Cell had to actually transform to get more powerful, which is very interesting because, like our heroes, you know, Cell had to go through a long evolution in order to get to his perfect form, and then essentially by accident he became Super Perfect Cell. And on another hand, you have a guy that had to actually work to get as strong as he did, manipulating people, absorbing a whole bunch of humans, and going through all of these different processes to get to that level of strength. You know, and even with other characters too, like Majin Buu, who's just as strong as he is, but Majin Buu, throughout multiple forms, had to absorb other characters to get stronger and fight against other Z fighters at certain times. Like, there's just this certain way where you either write a villain to just be super strong because he is, or the villain has to go through a process to get strong. And that's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed the Moro arc in particular, because not only was Moro extremely powerful, but he had an ability that allowed him to become a significantly greater threat where he could absorb other people's energy essentially, and by that he could also, by using 7-3 and merging with other characters, get all their abilities and get more powerful in his own way. And I feel like the combination of Moro combined with 7-3 made that arc probably the most refreshing Dragon Ball arc that we've had in a long time. But then when you look at it from Piccolo in Dragon Ball Super Superhero, I feel like I'm obligated as a Piccolo fan to say I'm happy with Piccolo, and to be honest with you, I am. And it's the same thing that I had with Master Roshi, you know, during the Tournament of Power, and even in Resurrection of F, where Master Roshi is one of my favorite characters. And even though I will openly admit that his power scaling makes absolutely no sense, like Master Roshi shouldn't even be anywhere near Yamcha's strength, but I like Master Roshi so much that you kind of just wink it off and just accept that even though his power scaling makes absolutely no sense, I really just like Master Roshi being around, so I'll just accept his character the way it is. And it's the same thing with Piccolo, who's my favorite character. Yeah, it's cheap that Piccolo is going to basically go to Shenron and ask to get a transformation, but at the same time, Piccolo's gotten virtually nothing in so long in Dragon Ball, to the point where it's like, as a Piccolo fan, you kind of feel like you're going to get what you're going to get, and you just accept it for what it is, in that particular sense. And it's one of those situations, guys, where, as a Dragon Ball fan, it feels really cheap that our heroes can now just wish for transformations, but at the same time, with the direction of Dragon Ball just making things so quick and fast to compete with how much more powerful Goku and Vegeta are now, I can understand why it's been moving in this direction. But the problem with this is that when you look at a character like Broly, he's just a traditional Dragon Ball villain, or attempted villain, because Broly's not necessarily a villain in more modern senses. But what made Broly feel so traditional in Dragon Ball Super Broly specifically is the fact that he was just an old classic guy that was extremely powerful, and Goku and Vegeta had to fight against him and figure out a way to defeat him. It didn't matter that Goku and Vegeta, you know, had to go through so many different types of training, learning God Ki, Super Saiyan God, Super Saiyan Blue, Ultra Instinct, all of these different things. Broly was just that powerful. And it's one of those things where when you make it more simplistic and say this guy is strong just because he is, or when you give a legitimate reason as to why the villain got more powerful, and a good example of this would even be to use Dragon Ball GT when you look at a character like Baby, and say in Baby's case, Baby had to essentially, very similar to Cell, go after other people's bodies, and I don't mean it like that because the way I worded that might sound a little bit weird, but the point we're trying to get at there is that Baby had to power himself up by hatching onto stronger host bodies, very similar to how Cell had to absorb people in his own right, and as a result of it, the power of the villains in the past felt a lot more natural. And I feel like for villains, you could either just make them strong just because or find a legitimate way to write it. But when you start touching heroes and start giving heroes transformations just because, it just starts falling out of line. And yeah, you could always have characters like Gotenks that can learn Super Saiyan relatively easy, But that's completely different from going to a divine dragon and essentially asking for that dragon to give you a transformation to compete. Had Piccolo figured out some way to break the laws of how Dragon Ball worked and discover a Namekian transformation all on his own, very similar to the Saiyans, that would have felt a lot more organic and felt a lot more natural into the story itself. But nowadays, a lot of Dragon Ball is just starting to feel very cheap.